להזמין את הדוברים הראשונים שיציגו את נושא כלכלת הדונאט, מגידול כלכלי לשגשוג אנושי. מירב כהן, זוהר ינוביץ' ורן רביב ממקימי קהילת הדונאט הישראלית, והדוברת המרכזית, שאנחנו מאוד שמחים שיכלה להצטרף אלינו היום, Kate Raworth. Kate, on behalf of the Israeli Climate Forum, thank you so much for being with us today. רן, בבקשה.
אז שלום, שמי רן רביב ממרכז השל, and we are very honored and excited to have the British economist Kate Raworth with us on this webinar. Thank you very much, Kate. I'll take a couple of minutes to talk about the Israeli context and why the doughnut economy, theory and practice, is so relevant to our challenge today. And then I'll let you present it. דבר ראשון, מי אנחנו? קהילת כלכלת הדונאט בישראל הוקמה על ידי היזמים מירב כהן וזוהר ינוביץ' ושותפות נוספות, יחד עם מרכז של לקיימות. אנחנו מקדמים את התפיסה בארץ. יש אתר המרכז את הפעילות ואת החומרים המתורגמים כבר לעברית. בקיץ יצא התרגום של הספר לעברית בהוצאת רדיקל. מה לפנינו בקטע הזה של הוובינר? אני אציג בקצרה את הרלוונטיות של התפיסה להקשר הישראלי. קייט ראוורת' תציג את העקרונות המרכזיים. מירב וזוהר יציגו את הפרקטיקות והיישומיות הנגזרות ומפותחות מהתיאוריה. איך עושים את זה ואיך זה נעשה בעולם ואיפה. מוזמנים להציג שאלות בצ'אט, במידה והזמן יאפשר, נענה עליהם. קייט או אנחנו. אז דבר ראשון, מה זה? כלכלת הדונאט. זה תיאוריה ופרקטיקה שלוקחת שתי פרספקטיבות שהיו נפרדות ומחברת ביניהן ובין המענים שלהן. מאפשרת לשתי הקבוצות, זו שעוסקת בחברה וכלכלה וזו שעוסקת בסביבה, שעד היום ישבו באולמות נפרדים בדרך כלל, להתחבר. התיאוריה והפרקטיקה שמציע המסגור של כלכלת הדונאט, מניח שפה, מתודה ופעולה משותפות בשני השדות האלה. כדוגמה טובה אולי ניתן לקחת את תהליך ישראל 50, התוכנית החשובה שהוביל המשרד להגנת הסביבה לפני שנתיים. היו לה שולחנות החשובים, תכנון, כלכלה, אנרגיה, והיה את הקבוצה שעסקה במעבר צודק. קראו לה העין החברתית. בתוך התהליך כשהצגנו את התוכניות בפני ארגונים, מומחים ופעילים שעוסקים ועובדים עם אוכלוסיות מודרות ומוחלשות, הם טענו, קודם כל אנחנו, או אלה שאנחנו מייצגים, לא השתתפנו במסיבה. וגם לא במציאת הדרכים לתקן את הנזקים שהיא גרמה. עכשיו כשמגיע הזמן לשלם את החשבון, אנחנו מוזמנים, לא ככה עושים את זה. ואני אגיד מתוך זה אני אגזור כמה מסקנות ונעבור לקייט. א', להסתכל על הסוגיות האלה בנפרד לא נכון, אבל גם לא אפקטיבי. קודם כל זה ממשיך לבנות חסם של נציגות פוליטית של ציבור רחב שעדיין חושב שמשבר האקלים והמשבר האקולוגי זו לא בעיה שלו. דבר שני, פתרון הבעיות החברתיות והכלכליות במורד הזרם, אחרי שכבר תכננו והצבנו את הכל, משאיר טווח צר לפעולה ודורש או לפרום את ההחלטות הקודמות, או משאיר את המדיניות הזאת ואת השאלות האלו כקישוט ותו לא. לכן אני חושב שהתיאוריה שתוצג כאן עם הכלים הפרקטיים הם רלוונטיים מאוד למציאות הישראלית, במיוחד לאור האתגרים הקונקרטיים שעומדים בפנינו כרגע, בהתמודדות עם משבר האקלים והמשבר האקולוגי בכלל. קייט ראוורת' היא כלכלנית בריטית, שותפה בכירה במכון לשינוי סביבתי באוניברסיטת אוקספורד, והמייסדת של Doughnut Economics Action Lab. הספר שלה, כלכלת הדונאט, יצא לאור ב-2017, הוא רב מחר בינלאומי ותורגם ליותר מ-20 שפות. כאמור, בקיץ הקרוב יצא התרגום שלו לעברית. Kate Raworth, again, thank you very much for your time. We are really appreciated. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a huge pleasure to join you all here today. Thank you to Zohar and Merav and yourself for inviting me to join you. Is it possible for that person to put themselves on mute? That would be very helpful, thank you.
So I'm going to go to everyone. Please, Kate, unmute yourself.
Yes.
Do you hear me now? You hear me now, great, lovely. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure and honor to join you all. So I'm delighted to be here in this climate forum. I think I'm here because I studied economics in the 1990s and I was profoundly frustrated by what I was taught. And it led me to write this book, Doughnut Economics, and I'm going to share the core ideas of that book with you today. But I'm going to invite us to step even further back and recognize that climate breakdown is one of the major signals to us all that there is a crisis in our economic thinking, but we know that the story and the rewrite is bigger even than that. So I'm going to share my screen. There we go. So I'm going to invite us all to think about the core ideas of what I'm going to call 20th century economics. The ideas that go so deeply into our minds, we don't even realize they're there. And even if you never studied economics, these ideas shape the way that all of us think and talk about the economy and what success looks like. So when I ask former economics students all over the world, what's the first image you remember learning in economics? It's the same everywhere. It's supply and demand. This diagram where the market is put at the center of our vision, where price becomes the metric of concern, price sitting there in the middle of the picture. It means that we are immediately talking about money as the metric of the economy, which is a big jump to make on day one. And anything that falls outside of the market contract gets called an externality. This means that we find ourselves talking about the breakdown of the climate, the breakdown of biodiversity in the world as an environmental externality. And to me, this is evidence enough that this theory is not fit for our times. We cannot talk about the death of the living planet as an environmental externality. We need a richer starting point. The portrait of humanity that's put at the heart of economics. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my arrow. There we are. Humanity is called rational economic man. And I drew this portrait of what economic theory tells us we are like. It would be a man with no dependence, standing alone, independent of mind and opinion. He has money in his hand, ego in his heart, a calculator in his head, and nature at his feet, as if the rest of the living world is merely resources for humanity. The real problem with this character is that on being told that we are like him, in fact, we become more like him. We start to mimic the model. Students say over time they value competition, they value self-interest rather than collaboration and altruism. So who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become. We must pay attention to the models that we make of ourselves. And then thirdly, the goal. What is the goal of the economy? This is so deep, it's almost never drawn on the page, but it sits inside every politician's speech and every economist's lectures. And the goal is of endless GDP growth. No matter how rich a nation is, you're sitting in Israel, I'm sitting in the UK, we're sitting in two of the richest nations in the world relative to human history. And yet the success of our economies, we are told, depends upon yet more growth endlessly. We need to go beyond this because I believe these ideas and many others, but these fundamental ideas have profoundly shaped the deep economic mindset that we have inherited from last century. And they explain and lead us into many of the crises that we now face. From financial meltdown in 2008 to the era now of climate and ecological breakdown that we live in, to the last 2 years of COVID lockdown. These crises hit people with extreme inequalities of gender and ethnicity, of wealth and power between the global north and the global south. And these crises emerge from systems that pursue endless expansion, whether it's an endlessly expanding financial sector, which creates its own bubble and collapse, whether it's endlessly expanding use of fossil fuels and Earth's resources, we induce the breakdown of the living world, or endless movement into wildlife areas coupled with global travel created perfect conditions for a global health pandemic. If we want to get beyond these crises that emerge from expansionist thinking, we need to come up with a new economic starting point. And that's what I propose with Doughnut Economics. So it starts with this image. This is the donut. The good news is you don't actually need to eat donuts here. We only need to think about the shape. This is a healthy one. In fact, it's the only one that turns out to be good for us. So if you think of humanity's use of Earth's resources radiating out from the center of that picture, then the hole in the middle of the donut is the place where people are left falling short on the essentials of life, where people do not have the food, health, energy, income, education, housing, political voice that every person in the world has a claim to. I can say this because all the world's governments have agreed through the Sustainable Development Goals. Every person has a claim to live above that social foundation, not falling short on the essentials of life. So leave no one in the hole. You could say this was the goal of 20th century economics, Keynesian economics. Ensure everybody has income, everybody can meet their needs. But now we know more and we know too much. We know that as we use Earth's resources, as we use fossil fuels and timber and water and fertilizer, we start to put pressure on the life-supporting systems of our planetary home. And that's the ecological ceiling. These are the 9 planetary boundaries recognized by Earth system scientists just over a decade ago. They are the life-supporting systems of this living planet. And we must not go over that limit either. So suddenly, the goal here is to leave no one in the hole, but don't overshoot the limits. And it's instantly changed the shape of progress. It's no longer endless growth. It's thriving in balance. And it's a balance that is very real, as others have already said in this webinar. Carbon tax versus the cost of living. How do we find that balance? If balance becomes the goal, we are very far from that right now, as we can see in this image. This shows us that millions, indeed billions of people worldwide are falling short on the essentials of life. And we are already overshooting multiple planetary boundaries. This is the global donut. I can show it to you for a range of countries. So here, Malawi, many people falling short on life's essentials without overshooting their pressure on the planet. China, like many countries, has a double challenge of falling short and in overshoot. And then I'm showing Sweden because people often think Sweden, Norway, Denmark, these are the most ecological, best countries in the world, but actually massively overshooting their pressure on the planet. So every nation must transform. I can show you now 100 nations. And the sweet spot is this top left-hand corner where nobody is left falling short. So everybody can meet their needs, but it's happening within the means of the planet. Just to show you, here is Israel, amongst many other countries. And this, to me, shows us there is no country in the world that is living in the donut. Costa Rica is closest at the moment, but every nation must transform. So low-income countries, how do they meet the needs of all of their people for the first time without overshooting planetary boundaries in the way that high-income countries have done? Middle-income countries, how are they going to do the double challenge of meeting people's needs and already coming back within planetary boundaries? And then these high-income countries, yours and mine, we need to massively reduce our footprint on the planet. How do we do that? Because that's never been done before either, recognizing there is also still inequality within these countries. And let's recognize that although these stand as separate dots on the page, these countries' stories and futures are profoundly interconnected through histories of colonialism, military power, trade and finance rules, resource extraction, and the current and future impacts of climate change. So we need transformations within and between nations. How then do we transform? What kind of economics would give us a chance of turning this story around? So I would never begin economics with supply and demand of the market. I begin it with this diagram. I call it the embedded economy diagram. It shows us that the economy is part of society. It is a social construct. We invented it, we can reinvent it. And society, human society, is embedded in the rest of the living world. We draw on Earth's materials. We put out waste and pollution. We are bathed in a river of solar energy. So the economy must work in compatibility with the dynamics of the living world. But let's dive inside the economy. And there we can see there are different ways that we meet our wants and needs. 20th century economics always starts with the market. And there in that space, we may be a consumer or producer. And as a producer, are you labor earning a wage or capital earning the profit in the return? Then 20th century economics says, okay, we also need the state. Well, who are we in relation to the state? We may be a public servant as a politician, a teacher, a doctor, a nurse, a resident of a place, a voter, and a protester. All of these important roles we play in each of us, our relationship to the state. This shows up in GDP accounting, but so much else matters that does not show up in GDP. We've got the household where we all begin every day as parent, partner, relative, or child, unpaid caring work that makes life work and worth living. And we have the commons where people volunteer, share, co-create, and steward collective resources. And I think one experience from the COVID crisis is that when the market space has been physically shut down due to the need for physical distancing, we've seen the rise of the public sector step in, and across the world, a conversation about whose work is essential work and why, therefore, is it paid so badly in so many places. We've seen households step in, caring, providing care for the sick, homeschooling for the children. And we've seen the commons step in with soup kitchens, with WhatsApp groups on your neighborhood street. And one thing people say they don't want to lose post-pandemic is that bigger sense of a we of society. We are not individualized, rational economic man. We are social, adaptable humans. How can we create economies that allow us to fulfill all of these roles that we actually each need to play? So that's a starting point, the embedded economy. But then also, coming back to this donut, we can see that all of the red here shows us we are living in a deeply unequal world. Millions of people can't meet their most essential needs, and yet others are overshooting their pressure on the planet. And we live in a deeply degraded world. We are running down the life support systems of this unique and delicately balanced living planet. How then do we turn around this story? And I believe we need to transform two dynamics of our economy. The economies need to become regenerative and distributive by design. And let me take you into each of these. So we have inherited linear, degenerative economies. We take Earth's materials, make them into things we want, use it for a while, and then throw it away. And that take, make, use, lose is pushing us over the limits of our planetary home. We need to bend these linear arrows into circular or cyclical arrows so that resources are not used up, they're used again and again. The waste from one process becomes food for the next. This is how nature has always worked. So some examples: regenerative agriculture shown here in New South Wales, Australia, or a sponge city in Kunli in China, recognizing that the places where we live are part of the living world and need to reconnect with the ecosystems. But also the materials we use. The city of Amsterdam has set up a whole district where every building must be made from circular materials that have been reused, can be reused, transforming the way that buildings are designed and the materials they're made from. City of Oslo and many others are now going car-free, saying we'll have only renewable energy transport of trams and buses and bicycles, no cars. So these are just some examples at the city or place-based scale of regenerative design. But we also have inherited divisive designs where our economies, through infrastructure, through regulation, through privilege, tend to capture opportunity and value in the hands of a few. How can we transform this rise of a global 1%, the rise of the billionaires that we've seen through COVID? How do we transform this to a distributive design where value and opportunity is shared far more equitably with all who co-created? A couple of examples from around the world. Think of renewable energy, which now can be placed on the rooftops, in fields, on hospitals, schools. It can also be owned locally, which means the power to generate energy becomes a distributed capacity. And then this cycling network I'm showing, again, another piece of infrastructure, creating primary routes, not for cars, but for bicycles, so that the cheapest, most affordable, most accessible form of transport becomes the easiest one for all. Just two examples of a distributed infrastructure. And then thinking about incomes, in Vienna, the city of Vienna, 60% of people live in social housing because the city decided that housing is not a luxury investment, it's a human right. And so the city itself and city cooperatives own the majority of the housing stock. It's central, it's high quality, it's affordable, it's normal. And then Stockton, California is one place that has trialed using a universal basic income, paying a guaranteed income to the lowest families. Over 18 months, they found an incredibly strong positive effect, enabling people to get out of the worst of poverty and to get out of long-term unemployment into work. Again, these are just 4 illustrations. I'm sure everybody can think of many, many other distributive designs. So I believe if we're going to transform our economies local to global, we need to create regenerative design and distributive design. Let me conclude just by pulling back. I began with these 20th century concepts, which I was taught. I believe many of today's economists in power, in politics, in government, in business, were taught these same concepts, and they still have too much influence because they do not serve our times. We need to begin again with recognizing that the economy is embedded in society and the living world, that humanity is social and we play multiple roles to meet our essentials, and that the goal is thriving in balance, humanity and the rest of the living world. I've shared the core concepts of Doughnut economics, but I'm very excited now to hand over to Merav, who will talk about what it could actually mean in practice in a place, because that's what matters, not theory, but how we turn these ideas into practice. So let me stop here and hand over. Thank you.